The silence in that hall wasn't just quiet, it was cruel. Clara Whitmore stood on the auction stage, her Christmas basket growing heavier in her trembling hands with each passing second. Around her, the entire town of Pine Hollow watched as bid after bid failed to come. They weren't just refusing to buy her basket, they were erasing her. A widow. A woman who'd buried too much. Someone they'd decided was cursed. The auctioneer's voice dropped lower, the price falling like her dignity, and still, nothing. Then boots echoed from the back of the room, and everything changed. If you want to know how one man's choice shattered a town's judgment and uncovered a secret that would change two broken lives forever, stay with me until the very end. And please, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The winter of 1883 had arrived in Pine Hollow, with the kind of cold that didn't just chill the skin. It settled into bones, into hearts, into the very foundations of the small mountain town. Snow had begun falling 3 days before the Christmas basket auction, blanketing the rutted roads and sagging rooftops in a silence that felt almost holy. But there was nothing holy about what was happening inside the Pine Hollow Community Hall that December evening. Clara Whitmore stood near the front of the crowded room, her hands clasped so tightly in front of her that her knuckles had gone white. She wore her best dress, the dark blue wool one she'd carefully mended the week before, patching the worn elbows with fabric salvaged from an old skirt. Her hair, still thick and chestnut brown despite everything she'd endured, was pinned back severely, revealing a face that was pale, angular, and marked by a weariness that no amount of sleep could cure. She was 32 years old. She felt ancient. The basket sat on the table before her, wrapped in a faded checkered cloth she'd washed and pressed until it looked almost new. Inside was everything she could afford to give. 2 loaves of bread baked from flour she'd stretched further than it should go, a jar of preserved peaches from the summer before last, a small wheel of cheese she'd traded eggs for, and an apple tart that had taken her 3 attempts to get right because her hands had been shaking so badly. It wasn't much, but it was honest. It was all she had. The auction had been going on for over an hour. One by one, the unmarried women and widows of Pine Hollow had presented their baskets, and one by one, the men of the town had bid on them. The tradition was simple. The highest bidder won the privilege of sharing the meal with the woman who'd prepared it. For some, it was courtship. For others, it was merely community, a way to support the women, to share food and conversation on a winter evening, to remind everyone that even in hardship, there was still connection. But Clara had watched as each basket before hers had been claimed with enthusiasm, with competitive bidding, with laughter and teasing and the warmth of belonging. She'd watched Sarah Mitchell's basket go for $3 to young Thomas Green, who'd been sweet on her since spring. She'd watched even old Widow Hartley's basket get snapped up by the blacksmith, a kind man who bid generously despite having no romantic interest, simply because that was what decent people did. And now it was Clara's turn. The auctioneer, a portly man named Vernon Hughes with a florid face and a voice that carried, lifted Clara's basket with both hands and held it aloft. "Next we have Mrs. Clara Whitmore's contribution," he announced, his tone notably flatter than it had been moments before. "Fine baking, as always. Who'll start the bidding at $2? Silence. Clara kept her eyes fixed on a point just above the crowd, her chin lifted in a posture that might have looked like pride, but was actually just her desperate attempt to hold herself together. She could feel their eyes on her, all of them. The women clustered in small groups, their heads bent together in whispered conversations. The men standing along the walls, shifting their weight, suddenly finding the floor or the ceiling fascinating. Vernon cleared his throat. $2 for this fine basket. Come now, gentlemen. Mrs. Whitmore's put together a lovely meal." More silence. Someone coughed. A child whimpered and was quickly shushed. Clara's heart was hammering so hard she thought surely everyone could hear it. Heat crept up her neck despite the cold. She knew what this was. She'd known, really, from the moment she'd decided to participate. But she'd hoped, God, she'd hoped, that maybe, just maybe, someone would show her a scrap of kindness. Not romance, not courtship. Just acknowledgement. Proof that she was still human, still part of this community she'd lived in for nearly a decade. $1? Vernon's voice had taken on an edge of desperation now. He was sweating despite the December chill. "Surely someone will bid $1. From somewhere in the middle of the crowd, Clara heard it, the sound she'd been dreading. A woman's voice, not quite whispered, but not quite spoken aloud either, just loud enough to carry, "Nobody wants to catch whatever darkness follows her around." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Her breath caught, her vision swam, but she didn't move, didn't turn, didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing how deeply it cut, because they'd been saying things like that for 2 years now. Ever since her daughter Grace had died of scarlet fever at age 6, following her husband William's death from a logging accident just 8 months before that. 2 graves in the churchyard, side by side, under a pine tree that shed its needles over the simple wooden crosses Clara couldn't afford to replace with proper stone markers. The town had been sympathetic at first. That's what people did. They brought food, they murmured condolences, they attended the funerals with solemn faces. But sympathy had an expiration date, apparently, especially when grief didn't follow the prescribed timeline, especially when a woman didn't bounce back, didn't remarry quickly, didn't smooth over her tragedy with a brave smile and a fresh start. Instead, Clara had retreated into her small homestead at the edge of town, had continued working her garden and tending her chickens and taking in mending work when she could get it. She'd kept to herself because she didn't have the energy for anything else, because she was barely surviving, because some days the simple act of getting out of bed felt like climbing a mountain, and the town had interpreted her isolation as something darker. Whispers had started, rumors that she'd been a bad wife, a negligent mother, suggestions that maybe William's death hadn't been entirely accidental. Had she pushed him to work when he was too tired? Had she distracted him? And Grace's illness, had Clara really done everything possible to save her, or had she given up too easily? None of it was true. All of it was believed. Vernon was practically pleading now. 50 cents, anyone? This is a Christmas basket auction, gentlemen, the spirit of the season. Some spirits ain't worth invoking, someone muttered from the back, and there was scattered laughter. Clara's hands were shaking. She pressed them harder together, her fingernails digging into her palms hard enough to leave crescents. She could leave. She could simply turn and walk out of this hall, out into the snow, and never come back. Let them have their auction. Let them have their community. Let them congratulate themselves on their charity and their Christian values while they excluded her from both. But her feet wouldn't move, because leaving would be admitting defeat, would be accepting their judgment. And some stubborn part of her, the part that had survived burying her whole family, that had endured 2 years of whispers and isolation, refused to give them that power. Vernon looked at her, and for just a moment, she saw pity in his eyes, which was somehow worse than the cruelty. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, "perhaps we should— $5. The voice came from the back of the hall, deep and rough and utterly certain. It cut through the murmuring crowd like an axe through kindling, and the entire room went silent. Clara's head snapped up. Vernon's jaw dropped. 200 people turned as one. Standing just inside the doorway, snow still melting on the shoulders of his heavy canvas coat, was Elias Crow. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that needed cutting and a beard that was more practical than fashionable. His face was weathered, lined around the eyes and mouth in the way of men who spent most of their time outdoors. He was somewhere in his 40s, Clara wasn't sure exactly, and he lived alone in a cabin about 5 miles up the mountain where he worked as a trapper and trader, bringing furs and timber down to sell when he needed supplies. He came to town perhaps once a month. He spoke to almost no one. He'd never attended a social function in all the years Clara had lived in Pine Hollow. And now he was standing in the doorway of the community hall, his hand raised, offering $5 for her basket. $5. More than anyone else had paid that entire evening. Vernon found his voice first. "Mr. Crow, that is, $5, you said?" $5. Elias moved forward through the crowd, which parted before him like water around a stone. His boots left wet prints on the wooden floor. His eyes, dark brown, almost black in the lamplight, were fixed on Clara's basket, not on Clara herself. "That's what I bid." "Well, that's very generous," Vernon stammered. He looked around the room, as if hoping someone might challenge the bid, might restore some normalcy to the situation. But the men who'd refused to bid 50 cents weren't about to compete with $5 from a man who looked like he could snap any of them in half without much effort. Vernon lifted his gavel. $5. Going once? Going twice? He paused, giving one last chance for intervention that didn't come. Sold! To Mr. Elias Crow! The gavel came down with a crack that seemed to echo forever. Clara couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process what had just happened. She watched as Elias reached the front of the room, pulled a worn leather wallet from his coat, and counted out $5 silver onto Vernon's waiting palm. Each coin clinked against the next with a finality that made Clara's stomach tighten. Then Elias picked up her basket. He turned to her, and for the first time his eyes met hers. They weren't kind, exactly, but they weren't cruel either. They were simply steady, assessing. The eyes of a man who'd learned to judge the worth of things in ways that had nothing to do with what other people thought. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. His voice was quieter than it had been when he'd made his bid, but it still carried that same certainty. "I believe the tradition is that we share this meal." Her throat was so tight she could barely speak. "Yes," she managed. Yes." The room was still silent, everyone watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Clara could feel the weight of their judgment, their shock, their hungry curiosity about what scandal might unfold. The widow and the recluse, the cursed woman and the strange mountain man. It would give them weeks of gossip. She didn't care anymore. "There are tables outside on the porch," Clara said, finding her voice. "It'll be cold, but—" "I prefer the cold," Elias said simply. "After you." He stepped aside, making space for her to lead the way. Clara lifted her chin, gathered her shawl around her shoulders, and walked toward the door. The crowd parted for her just as it had for him, but where they'd moved for him out of respect, or perhaps wariness, they moved for her out of something else. Avoidance. As if tragedy might be contagious. "Let them think what they want," Clara told herself as she pushed through the door and out into the December night. Let them whisper. They've been doing it for 2 years. What's one more night? The porch was covered but open on 3 sides, and the cold hit her like a wall. Her breath plumed white in the darkness. Snow was still falling, soft and steady, muffling the sounds of the town. The mountains rose black against the slightly less black sky, their peaks lost in clouds. There were 2 rough wooden tables set up, meant for overflow from inside, but no one had used them yet. Clara moved to the farthest one, the one most shrouded in shadow, and sat down on the bench. Elias followed, setting the basket on the table between them. He sat across from her, his movements economical and sure. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Clara could hear the muffled sounds from inside the hall, music starting up, the fiddles and banjo beginning a reel, people resuming their celebration now that the uncomfortable moment had passed. Out here, there was only the whisper of snow and the creak of the porch boards. "I should thank you," Clara said finally. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, thin, fragile. "What you did in there, that was kind." "Wasn't kindness," Elias said bluntly. She looked up, startled. "I don't understand." He met her gaze steadily. "Kindness is doing something for someone else's benefit. I didn't bid on your basket to save you embarrassment, Mrs. Whitmore. I bid on it because I wanted to." Clara blinked. "Wanted to?" "Been watching you for a while now." He said it matter-of-factly, as if he were commenting on the weather. "When I come to town, you're at the Mercantile sometimes, or the post office. I've seen you working in your garden when I pass by on the road." A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran down Clara's spine. "You've been watching me?" "Noticing you," he corrected. "Not the same thing. I notice a lot of things most people miss. Comes from living alone, I suppose. You pay attention differently when you're not distracted by constant company." Clara wasn't sure how to respond to that. Part of her wanted to be offended. What right did this stranger have to notice her, to watch her, to make decisions about her? But another part of her, the part that was still reeling from the humiliation of the auction, was simply too tired to muster offense. "What exactly did you notice?" she asked instead. Elias considered the question. "That you work harder than any 3 people I know. That you keep your homestead better than most men with help. That you don't complain, don't ask for charity, don't make a spectacle of your grief." He paused. and that the people in that hall who just treated you like you're invisible are goddamn fools. The profanity should have shocked her. Instead, it made something in her chest loosen just slightly, because it was honest, raw, not dressed up in polite euphemisms or careful Christian charity. They think I'm cursed, Clara heard herself say. They think I brought death to my family, that I'm tainted somehow. Do you believe that? No. The answer came immediately, firmly. I loved my husband. I loved my daughter. Their deaths were tragedies, not judgments, not punishments, just terrible luck. Elias nodded once, as if she'd confirmed something he'd already suspected. Then their opinions don't matter. Easy to say when you're not the one being shunned. I've been shunned my whole life, Mrs. Whitmore. His voice was calm, factual. Difference is, I chose it. You had it forced on you, but the result's the same. You learn to decide what you value, other people's approval, or your own integrity. Clara looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. In the dim light spilling from the hall's windows, she could see the scars on his hands, the worn edges of his clothes, the way he held himself with a kind of self-contained certainty that came from years of relying on no one but himself. This was a man who'd made peace with solitude, who'd probably had to. Why did you really bid on my basket? She asked quietly. Elias was silent for a moment, his fingers drumming once on the table surface. Then, because everyone deserves to be seen, and because I spent 5 years of my life learning that when you see something worth knowing, you don't wait for permission or approval, you act. Worth knowing, Claire repeated. You don't know anything about me. Then let's change that. He gestured to the basket. You going to open that, or are we just going to sit here freezing? Despite everything, the humiliation, the confusion, the surreal strangeness of this entire situation, Clara felt the corners of her mouth twitch. Not quite a smile, but close. She reached for the basket, unwrapping the checkered cloth with fingers that were steadier now. The food looked humble in the lamplight, simple, but Elias surveyed it with the same careful attention she'd seen him give everything else, and when she handed him a piece of bread, he took it with something that looked like respect. You make this yourself? He asked, examining the loaf. Everything. The bread, the preserves, the tart. He took a bite, chewed thoughtfully. It's good, really good. Better than anything I could make. That's a low bar if you've been living alone for years. This time it was Elias whose mouth twitched. Fair point. They ate in silence for a while. It should have been awkward, two strangers sharing a meal in the cold and dark, while an entire town celebrated inside without them. But somehow it wasn't. The silence felt comfortable, like neither of them needed to fill it with meaningless chatter. Clara found herself relaxing degree by degree. The bread was good. She'd worried it was too dense, but Elias seemed genuinely appreciative. The preserved peaches were sweet, summer trapped in glass, and when she apologized for the tart being a little overdone on one edge, Elias just shrugged and said he liked the crispy parts best. Can I ask you something? Clara said when they'd made their way through most of the basket. You can ask. Can't promise I'll answer. Why do you live alone up in the mountains? You're clearly capable of being around people when you choose to be. Elias set down the piece of cheese he'd been eating and leaned back, his eyes going distant. Had a wife once, he said after a moment. Anne. We were young, planning to build a life together. She got pregnant our first year of marriage. Clara's breath caught. Past tense. The way he said it told her everything. Fever took her in the 8th month, Elias continued, his voice still level but with something beneath it now, something old and buried deep. Baby died with her. Tried to save them both, the doctor, the midwives, me. Nothing worked. He paused. That was 15 years ago. After that, being around people just hurt. Reminded me of everything I'd lost. Mountains don't do that. Mountains just are. I'm sorry, Clara whispered. So am I. He met her eyes again. But I learned something from it. Grief doesn't make you cursed, Mrs. Whitmore. It makes you human. Anyone who says otherwise has never really lost anything that mattered. The words settled over Clara like a blanket. Not warm exactly, but covering, protective. Because here was someone who understood, who'd stood where she was standing, who'd survived it. How did you... She struggled to find the words. How did you keep going? Elias considered this. Didn't have a choice. Body kept waking up every morning, whether I wanted it to or not. So eventually I figured I might as well do something with those mornings. Built my cabin, learned to trap, taught myself to be useful to myself since I couldn't stand being useful to anyone else. He paused. It's not happiness, what I've got, but it's peace. Most days, that's enough. Clara understood that completely. Peace, not joy, not fulfillment, just the absence of constant pain, the ability to wake up without drowning. It was more than she'd had some days. The town thinks you're strange, she said. The town thinks you're cursed. Seems like we're both misunderstood. He smiled then, just slightly. We could start a club. That surprised a laugh out of her, a real one, short and sharp, the first she'd experienced in longer than she could remember. It felt strange in her throat, rusty from disuse, but also good, like a muscle being stretched after too long cramped. Elias watched her with something that might have been satisfaction. There, he said quietly. That's what I noticed. Under all that grief and exhaustion, there's someone who's not broken. Bent, maybe. Worn down, but not broken. Clara looked away, afraid suddenly of what her face might reveal. Because he was right, and being seen that clearly by a virtual stranger was both terrifying and exhilarating. From inside the hall came a burst of laughter and applause. Someone had finished a particularly spirited dance. Out here in the cold and dark, Clara and Elias sat with half a basket of simple food between them and a conversation that felt more substantial than anything she'd experienced in 2 years. What happens now? Clara asked. After tonight? Elias was quiet for a moment. That's up to you. I'm not courting you, Mrs. Whitmore. Want to be clear about that. I'm not looking for a wife and you're not looking for a husband. But he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. But I wouldn't mind having someone to talk to once in a while. Someone who understands what it's like to carry weight. And maybe you could use the same. It wasn't a romantic proposition. It wasn't even really a friendship. Not yet. It was just possibility. The suggestion that isolation didn't have to be absolute. That two people who'd learned to survive alone might occasionally choose not to be. I'd like that, Clara said quietly. Then I'll come by your place sometime this week. Noticed your porch steps are rotting out. Could fix those for you. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, but I've got the time and the skills, and you've got the need. Seems practical. Practical. Not charity. Not pity. Just an exchange between equals based on capability and necessity. Clara could accept that. They finished the meal as the snow continued to fall. When the basket was empty except for crumbs, Elias stood, collecting the containers carefully and placing them back in the basket. Clara stood too, pulling her shawl tighter. Thank you, she said, for all of this, for— Don't thank me yet, Elias interrupted, but his tone was gentle. Town's going to have plenty to say about this, about us, just so you know what you're agreeing to. Clara thought about the women inside, their whispered conversations and pointed looks, thought about the men who'd let her basket sit unbid while they congratulated themselves on their community spirit, thought about 2 years of isolation and judgment and the slow erosion of her sense of belonging. Let them talk, she said. They've been talking anyway. At least now I'll have given them something real to discuss. Elias smiled, a real smile this time, reaching his eyes. You're tougher than they know. I've had to be. He nodded once, understanding. Then he handed her the basket, touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was old-fashioned and oddly courtly, and turned to leave. Clara watched him walk down the porch steps and out into the snow, his figure growing dimmer until the darkness swallowed him completely. Inside the hall, the music played on. The auction continued with dessert baskets, with dancing, with all the warm community celebration she was no longer part of. But standing there in the cold, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt seen. And tomorrow, when the whispers started, when the speculation began about the widow and the mountain man, when the town turned its collective judgment on this strange new development, Clara would face it the same way she'd faced everything else in the last 2 years. She would survive it, but this time she wouldn't have to survive it alone. The snow had stopped by morning, leaving Pine Hollow blanketed in white silence. Clara woke before dawn, as she always did, her body trained by years of necessity to rise when the world was still dark. She lay there for a moment in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling beams of her small cabin, and remembered. The auction. The silence. Elias Crow's voice cutting through the crowd like an axe through frozen wood. $5. The weight of his gaze across a table on a cold porch, steady and unflinching. She sat up, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The fire had died overnight, and the cabin was cold enough that ice had formed on the inside of the window. Clara wrapped a quilt around her shoulders and moved to the stove, her bare feet quick on the wooden floor. Within minutes, she had kindling crackling, small flames licking at larger pieces of wood, heat beginning to chase the worst of the cold away. As she dressed in layers, chemise, petticoat, the same mended wool dress she'd worn last night, a heavy sweater with patches at the elbows, Clara tried not to think about what would happen today. But it was impossible. In a town the size of Pine Hollow, news traveled faster than wildfire. By now, everyone would know that the strange mountain man had bought the cursed widow's basket. They'd be dissecting it over breakfast, speculating over morning coffee, building entire narratives out of one simple transaction. She didn't care. Or at least she told herself she didn't care. The caring was what had nearly broken her these past 2 years. The desperate need for their approval, their acceptance, their acknowledgement that she was still human despite her losses. But last night, sitting in the cold with a man who understood grief without needing it, explained something had shifted. Not healed. She wasn't naive enough to think one conversation could heal 2 years of wounds, but shifted, like a door opening just a crack, letting in the possibility of light. Clara was feeding her chickens when she heard the wagon. The sun had been up for perhaps an hour, pale and weak through thin clouds. Her small flock clustered around her feet, clucking and pecking at the scattered grain, their breath steaming in the cold. She looked up at the sound of wheels crunching through snow and saw a sturdy wagon pulled by 2 dark horses coming up the path to her homestead. Elias Crow sat on the driver's bench, reins held loosely in gloved hands. The wagon bed behind him was loaded with lumber, fresh-cut pine boards. She could tell even from a distance, the kind you paid good money for at the mill. Clara's heart did something complicated in her chest. He'd said he'd come by this week. She hadn't expected him the very next morning. He brought the wagon to a halt near her porch and climbed down with the easy grace of a man comfortable with physical work. He wore the same heavy coat as last night, but in daylight she could see more details. The way it had been repaired multiple times, patches sewn with careful stitches. The collar lined with fur he'd probably trapped himself. "Morning, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, touching his hat brim. "Mr. Crow?" Clara scattered the last of the grain and brushed her hands on her apron. "I didn't expect you quite so soon." "Weather's clear. Seemed like a good day for repairs." He glanced at her porch steps, which sagged dangerously on one side, the wood soft with rot. "Those are worse than I thought. You've been using them like that?" "Carefully," Clara said. "I've been meaning to fix them myself, but you've had about 17 other things that needed fixing more urgently, and you're only one person with limited time and resources," Elias finished. "I know how that goes." He moved to the wagon and began unloading boards. Clara watched for a moment, then set down her grain bucket and moved to help. Elias glanced at her but didn't protest, just adjusted his grip so she could take the other end of a long plank. They worked in silence, carrying lumber to the porch. The wood was good quality, and Clara's conscience pricked. "How much do I owe you for the materials?" "Nothing." "Mr. Crow, I can't just—" "You can, and you will." He set down his end of a board and straightened, looking at her directly. "I had the lumber already. Been meaning to rebuild my storage shed come spring. I've got plenty. And before you argue—" He held up a hand as Clara opened her mouth. "Think of it as an investment in community safety. Those steps give way while you're carrying something heavy, you break your neck, and then I'd feel obliged to attend your funeral. I don't like funerals." The bluntness of it should have been offensive. Instead, Clara found herself fighting a smile. "That's remarkably pragmatic reasoning. I'm a remarkably pragmatic man." He pulled a tool belt from the wagon and buckled it around his waist. "You have coffee?" "I do." "Then go make some while I work. I'll be here a few hours." Clara wanted to protest, to insist on helping, but she recognized the set of his shoulders. This was a man who'd decided on a course of action and wouldn't be swayed. So she went inside, built up the fire, and put coffee on to boil. Through the window, she watched Elias work. He moved with the efficiency of someone who'd done this kind of work 1,000 times. First he pried off the old steps, examining each piece of rotted wood with the same careful attention he'd given her bread last night. Then he measured, marked, and began cutting new supports. His movements were economical, no wasted motion, every action purposeful. By the time Clara brought out 2 tin cups of strong black coffee, the framework for new steps was already taking shape. Elias accepted the cup with a nod of thanks and drank half of it in one long swallow, apparently unbothered by the scalding temperature. "You do good work," Clara observed, standing on the porch above him. "I do functional work. There's a difference." He set the cup down and picked up his hammer. Pretty doesn't matter much when you're alone in the mountains, but solid does. Something built solid will keep you alive. Clara sipped her own coffee, thinking about that. Is that what you've been doing all these years? Building things solid? That and learning which things can't be built at all. Which things you just have to accept as broken and work around them. The words hung in the cold air between them, heavy with meaning that had nothing to do with carpentry. Clara understood exactly what he meant. There were parts of her that would never be unbroken. The part that had been William's wife. The part that had been Grace's mother. Those pieces had died with them. She'd had to learn to function despite their absence, to build a life around the holes they'd left. "Does it get easier?" she asked quietly. "The working around?" Elias drove a nail with 3 precise strikes before answering. "Not easier, more familiar. You learn where the edges are, how to navigate without falling in." He glanced up at her. "But you already know that. You've been doing it for 2 years. Not very well. You're still here, still standing. That's well enough." A wagon rattled past on the main road, about 100 yards from Clara's property. She saw Mrs. Henderson driving it and watched as the older woman's head swiveled to stare at the scene before her. Clara on her porch, Elias working on her steps, his wagon parked in her yard like he belonged there. Mrs. Henderson's eyes went wide, and she snapped the reins, hurrying her horse along faster than necessary. "Here we go," Clara murmured. Elias followed her gaze and shrugged. "Let her look. Free country. She'll tell everyone she knows by noon. She'll tell them what she saw, a man fixing some steps. The rest is just stories they tell themselves." He selected another board and positioned it carefully. "You worried about what they'll say?" Clara thought about that. "I spent 2 years being worried about what they'd say, what they'd think, trying to be invisible enough that they'd stop noticing me, stop judging me, stop whispering when I walk by." She paused. "I don't think I have the energy to worry anymore." "Good." Elias drove another nail home. "Worry's exhausting. Better to just live and let them catch up when they're ready." They fell into a comfortable rhythm after that. Clara went back inside and worked on her mending. A pile of shirts and trousers from families in town who still gave her work because her stitches were neat and her prices were low, even if they wouldn't speak to her at church. Through the window, she watched Elias transform her dangerous, rotting steps into something solid and new. He worked steadily for 3 hours, pausing only to drink more coffee when Clara brought it out. By midday, the steps were finished, 6 sturdy treads and 2 landings, all level and square, the wood plane smooth so there'd be no splinters. Elias tested each one, bouncing his considerable weight on them before nodding with satisfaction. "That'll hold," he said. "Give the wood a few days to settle, then you'll want to seal it before the next snow. You have linseed oil?" "A little. I'll bring more when I come back." Clara descended the new steps slowly, marveling at how solid they felt under her feet. No creaking, no shifting, no wondering if today would be the day they finally gave way. "When will you come back?" Elias was packing his tools into the wagon. "Noticed your chicken coop has a hole in the roof. Rain gets in there, you'll lose birds to sickness. Figured I'd patch it next time. Maybe day after tomorrow if the weather holds." "Mr. Crow, you don't need to—" He turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Mrs. Whitmore, we're going to have this argument every time I come here, aren't we?" "Probably." Then let's settle it now. I live alone. I work when I want, on what I want. Right now, what I want is to fix things that need fixing for someone who can't do it all themselves. Not because you're helpless, you're clearly not, but because everyone needs help sometimes, and you've been too proud or too isolated to ask for it. He softened slightly. Let me do this. Not as charity, as friendship, or whatever we're calling this. Friendship. The word felt foreign in Clara's mouth, strange after 2 years of isolation, but it also felt like possibility. On one condition, she said. Elias raised an eyebrow. What's that? You let me feed you while you work. I've got stew on, and biscuits. You've been working for hours. You must be hungry. He considered this. That seems fair. They ate inside at Clara's small kitchen table. The cabin was simple. One main room that served as kitchen, living area, and workspace, with a tiny bedroom partitioned off in the back. But it was clean and well kept, everything in its place. The kind of order that came from having very few possessions and taking care of them meticulously. The stew was rabbit, which Clara had trapped herself last week, cooked with potatoes and carrots from her root cellar. The biscuits were plain but well made, golden on top and fluffy inside. Elias ate with the same focused attention he brought to everything else, and Clara found herself eating more than she had in days, her appetite awakened by having company. You're a good cook, Elias said, sopping up stew with his second biscuit. I had to learn to be. William was... She paused, surprised by her own willingness to speak his name. He worked hard, but he needed fuel. Lots of it. Lots. And then with Grace, I wanted to make sure she ate well, stayed strong. Her throat tightened. Not that it mattered in the end. Scarlet fever doesn't care how well you cook, Elias said quietly, or how much you love them, or how hard you try. It just takes. Like childbirth fever. Like childbirth fever, he agreed. They sat in silence for a moment, two people who'd learned the same brutal lesson about the randomness of loss. Do you ever... Clara started, then stopped, unsure if the question was too personal. Ever what? Ever regret surviving when they didn't? Elias set down his spoon slowly. Every day for the first 2 years, then occasionally for the next 5. Now? He considered. Now I think I survived because I survived, and their deaths don't become more meaningful if I waste the life I've still got. Anne wouldn't have wanted me to die with her. She was practical that way. Clara nodded. William had been practical too. He'd have been furious to see her wallowing in grief, neglecting herself, letting the homestead fall into disrepair. Be stubborn, Clara, he'd told her once when she was sick with influenza and insisting she was fine. Being stubborn keeps you alive when being reasonable would let you quit. She'd forgotten how to be stubborn somewhere along the way. Maybe it was time to remember. They finished the meal, and Elias helped her wash the dishes, an offer she accepted because it seemed churlish to refuse, and because it was oddly pleasant to have someone else's hands in the dishwater beside hers. Then he gathered his tools, hitched up his wagon, and prepared to leave. Day after tomorrow, then, he said, climbing onto the driver's bench. For the chicken coop. I'll have coffee ready. He smiled, that small, contained expression that seemed to be his version of delight, and snapped the reins. Clara watched the wagon roll down her path and turn onto the main road, heading back toward the mountains where Elias lived his solitary life. She stood there on her new, solid steps until the wagon disappeared from view, then went back inside to finish her mending. The whispers started that afternoon. Clara needed thread from the mercantile, and she needed it today if she was going to finish the shirts she'd promised by week's end. So she bundled herself in her heavy cloak, tucked her coin purse in her pocket, and walked the 1.5 miles into town. Pine Hollow's main street was quiet in the early afternoon, just a few wagons parked outside the stores, a handful of people going about their business. Clara kept her head up as she walked, refusing to scuttle along like she was ashamed. She passed the smithy, where Benjamin Cooper was shoeing a horse, and saw him pause mid-strike to stare. She passed the post office, where Harriet Mills was sorting mail, and watched the woman's mouth form a perfect O of shock before she spun to whisper urgently to someone inside. By the time Clara reached the mercantile, she knew the entire town was talking. The bell above the door chimed as she entered. Mr. Peterson, the proprietor, looked up from where he was stocking shelves, and his face went through a complicated series of expressions: surprise, calculation, uncertainty. Behind him, Clara could see his wife Martha whispering to Sarah Mitchell, the young woman whose basket had gone for $3 just last night. "Mrs. Whitmore," Mr. Peterson said, his voice overly hearty. "What can I do for you today?" "I need thread, black and brown, if you have them." Of course, of course." He bustled to the thread cabinet, making a show of searching through the spools. "Doing some mending?" "Yes." "That's good. Good to stay busy. Idle hands and all that." He was babbling, which meant he wanted to ask questions but wasn't sure how. Clara decided to save him the trouble. "I also need linseed oil, if you have a bottle." "Linseed oil? You doing some woodwork?" "Mr. Crow is. He rebuilt my porch steps this morning. They needed sealing." The silence that fell over the mercantile was absolute. Even the ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to stop. Martha Peterson's hand froze mid-gesture. Sarah Mitchell's eyes went wide. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. "Mr. Crow, the trapper?" "Yes." "He was at your place this morning." "Yes." Clara met his eyes steadily. "Is there a problem with that?" "No, no, of course not. That is—" He fumbled for words, clearly caught between curiosity and propriety. "It's just unusual, that's all. Mr. Crow doesn't usually involve himself in town affairs." "My porch steps needed fixing. He had the skills and materials. It seemed practical." Clara used the same word Elias had and found she liked the weight of it. Practical, straightforward. Not romantic, not scandalous, just practical. Martha Peterson couldn't contain herself any longer. "Is it true he paid $5 for your basket last night? $5 whole dollars?" "Yes." "But why would he— what would possess him to—" Martha caught herself, but the damage was done. "What would possess anyone to want your basket?" she'd almost said. "What would make you worth $5? Clara felt the familiar heat of shame creeping up her neck, but she pushed it down. "You'd have to ask him that, Mrs. Peterson. I can't speak to his motivations." "It just seems strange," Sarah Mitchell said, her voice higher than usual, nervous. Everyone knows Mr. Crow keeps to himself. And you, that is, after everything you've been through." "After my husband and daughter died, you mean?" Clara said bluntly. "Yes, I've been through tragedy." "That doesn't make me poisonous to be around." Sarah flushed bright red. "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did." Clara turned back to Mr. Peterson, who was holding thread and looking like he desperately wished to be anywhere else. "How much for the thread and oil?" He quoted a price. Clara paid it, tucked the items into her basket, and turned to leave. But at the door, she paused and looked back at the three people watching her with a mixture of shock and fascination. "Mr. Crow is coming back day after tomorrow to fix my chicken coop," she said clearly, "in case anyone else needs to know for their accounting." She left before they could respond, the bell chiming behind her like punctuation. The walk home felt longer than usual, every step weighted with the knowledge of what she'd just done. She'd confirmed the gossip, given them ammunition. By tomorrow, the entire town would be speculating about her and Elias Crow, building narratives about the widow and the recluse, making assumptions about intentions and impropriety. But when Clara reached her homestead and saw the solid new steps leading up to her porch, she found she didn't regret it. Let them talk. She had a friend, or whatever Elias was, who saw past her grief to the person underneath. That was worth more than their approval had ever been. True to his word, Elias returned 2 days later with materials to patch the chicken coop, and then he came back 4 days after that to shore up a section of fence that had started leaning, and then again the following week to replace a cracked window pane that Clara had been covering with oiled paper through the winter. Each visit followed the same pattern. Elias would arrive mid-morning, work for several hours with focused efficiency, and accept Clara's offer of a meal in exchange. They'd eat together, talking about practical things: weather, repairs, the best way to preserve vegetables, how to tell when a trapline was played out. Sometimes they talked about deeper things, memories of the people they'd lost, the strange arithmetic of survival, the way grief changed shape over time without ever really disappearing, and each time someone from town would happen to pass by. or Clara would need something from the mercantile and face the whispers, the stares, the carefully worded questions that weren't quite accusations but weren't quite innocent either. 3 weeks after the auction, Clara was at the post office when she overheard Martha Peterson talking to Harriet Mills outside. "I'm telling you, it's not right. A man spending that much time at a widow's home, unchaperoned. What must they be doing?" "Maybe he really is just doing repairs," Harriet suggested doubtfully. "For 3 weeks? What is there to repair? The woman lives in a cabin, not a mansion." Martha's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper that still carried clearly. "Mark my words, there's something untoward happening. First she loses her family under suspicious circumstances, and now this? The woman attracts darkness like a flame attracts moths." Clara's hands clenched around the letter she'd just retrieved, a notice about taxes due on her property. She could walk away, pretend she hadn't heard. That's what she would have done 6 months ago, a year ago. But something had changed in her. Maybe it was Elias's steady presence, his refusal to engage with the town's judgment. Maybe it was simply that she'd reached the limit of what she could endure in silence. She stepped outside, and both women startled like guilty children. "Mrs. Peterson," Clara said calmly. "Mrs. Mills, I couldn't help but overhear your conversation." Martha flushed but lifted her chin defiantly. "We were just expressing concern, Mrs. Whitmore, for your reputation." "My reputation?" Clara let the words sit in the cold air. "Tell me, Mrs. Peterson, what exactly do you think is happening? Please, be specific." That's not... You can't expect me to, because if you're suggesting that Mr. Crow's kindness in helping a neighbor with necessary repairs is somehow improper, I'd like to hear you say it plainly. Not hidden in whispers and insinuation, but out loud, where everyone can hear. Harriet Mills looked uncomfortable. "Clara, we don't mean any harm." "Don't you?" Clara turned to her. "Then why have you been crossing the street to avoid me for 2 years? Why did no one bid on my basket at the auction? Why has this entire town treated me like I'm contagious ever since William and Grace died?" "That's not fair," Martha protested. "We've been respectful of your grief." "You've been afraid of my grief," Clara corrected. "Afraid it might touch you. Afraid that if tragedy could strike me, it could strike you too. So you pushed me away, made me other, told yourself stories about why I deserved what happened, because that made you feel safe." The words poured out, 2 years of silent hurt given voice. Both women stood frozen, shocked by the outburst from someone they'd clearly decided was too broken to fight back. "And now," Clara continued, her voice quieter but no less firm, "now that someone has shown me simple human kindness, you can't stand it, because it exposes what you haven't been. So you make up stories about impropriety to justify your own cruelty." "We're not cruel," Harriet whispered. "Then what would you call it? When you let my basket sit unbid? When you whisper about me in the mercantile? When you teach your children to avoid the cursed widow's house?" Clara's voice cracked slightly, but she pushed through. "Mr. Crow has been more Christian in his actions than this entire town has been in 2 years of Sunday services. And if that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps the problem isn't with me or him. Perhaps it's with you." She turned and walked away before they could respond, before her composure could crack entirely, before the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes could fall where they'd see them. But she'd made it only a few steps when she heard Harriet call out, "Clara, wait!" She stopped but didn't turn around. "You're right." Harriet's voice was small, ashamed. "You're right about all of it. I've been afraid. When your Grace died, all I could think about was my own children. How easily it could have been them. And instead of being there for you, I pulled away. I'm sorry." Clara turned slowly. Harriet had tears on her cheeks, her face red with cold and emotion. Martha stood beside her, looking shaken but silent. "I don't need your pity," Clara said quietly. "It's not pity, it's recognition of my own failings, of how badly we've treated you." Harriet took a shaky breath. "I can't speak for everyone, but I can speak for myself, and I'm sorry. Truly. It wasn't absolution. It wasn't enough to erase 2 years of isolation and pain, but it was something, a crack in the wall of judgment that had surrounded her." Clara nodded once, then continued home. That evening, as she sat by her fire working on mending with fingers made clumsy by emotion, she heard a knock at her door. She opened it to find Elias standing there with a rabbit already skinned and dressed, holding it out like an offering. "Trap 2 today. Figured you could use one for stew." Clara took the rabbit, then stepped aside. "Come in. I have coffee on." He entered, settling into the chair by the fire that had somehow become his over the past few weeks. Clara poured coffee, and they sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. "Heard you had words with some of the town ladies today," Elias said finally. Clara's head snapped up. "How did you—" "Ran into Sarah Mitchell at the general store. She was there when Harriet Mills came back, apparently all shaken up, talking about how you'd confronted Martha Peterson." He sipped his coffee. "Sarah seemed impressed, actually." "I probably made everything worse. Or you made it clear you won't be walked on anymore." Elias studied her across the rim of his cup. "There's a difference between keeping the peace and letting people abuse you. Sounds like you finally drew the line." "The whole town will be talking about it tomorrow." "They were already talking. At least now they know you can hear them." He set down his cup. "You worried about your reputation?" Clara thought about that. About standing in the cold outside the post office, saying out loud things she'd kept silent for 2 years, about the way it had felt, terrifying and liberating at once. "No," she said, surprised by her own certainty. "I don't think I am anymore." Elias smiled. "Good. Because I brought more lumber. Noticed your woodshed roof is sagging. Figured I'd shore it up tomorrow if you're amenable." "The whole town is going to think we're—" Clara stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. "Let them think what they want. We know the truth." But later that night, lying in her narrow bed and listening to the wind in the pines, Clara wondered what the truth actually was. Because something was growing between her and Elias, something that went beyond practical repairs and shared meals. It wasn't romance, neither of them was ready for that, might never be ready, but it was connection, understanding, the quiet comfort of not being alone. And maybe, Clara thought as sleep finally claimed her, maybe that was enough. Winter deepened over Pine Hollow, and with it came a rhythm that Clara had forgotten was possible. Elias arrived every few days, always with some new project he'd noticed needed attention, always staying for a meal, always leaving before dark but never hurrying away. The town watched and whispered, but the whispers had changed in tone. Less scandalous speculation, more grudging curiosity about what exactly was happening between the widow and the mountain man. Clara found she cared less each day. Her homestead was in better repair than it had been in years. Her firewood was stacked neatly under a newly reinforced shed. Her fences stood straight and strong. And for the first time since William's death, she woke up in the morning without the immediate crush of loneliness that had defined her existence. But there was something she hadn't told Elias. Something she'd barely admitted to herself. It was mid-December, nearly a month after the auction, when Clara woke before dawn with her hand pressed to her stomach, and the truth she'd been avoiding rising up like floodwater she could no longer hold back. She'd missed her courses. Not once, but twice. And there were other signs she'd been attributing to stress, to poor eating, to anything except what they actually meant. She was pregnant, with William's child, a final gift from a dead man, planted in her body weeks before the auction, before Elias, before everything had changed. She counted backward, her hands shaking, and placed it at early October, one of the last times she and William had been together before the accident. 4 months now. Maybe a bit more. Far enough along that there was no mistaking it, no pretending it might be something else. Clara sat on the edge of her bed as the room slowly lightened with dawn, and felt the foundation of her carefully rebuilt life crack beneath her. She was pregnant, unmarried, in a town that had already judged her harshly for lesser sins, with a child who would be branded illegitimate unless she could prove— But how could she prove anything? William had been dead for over 2 years. No one would believe her. They'd assume the worst, that Elias was the father, that their practical friendship had been a lie covering something sordid, that Clara was exactly the kind of woman they'd always suspected her of being. And Elias, what would he think? He'd been so clear that he wasn't courting her, that this was friendship built on mutual understanding of loss. How could she tell him she was carrying another man's child? What would he do? Would he disappear back into his mountains, wanting nothing to do with her complications? Would he look at her differently, See her as a problem rather than a person? The question spun in her mind like a storm she couldn't escape. She made it through the morning mechanically, feeding chickens, starting a fire, making coffee she couldn't stomach drinking. Her hands moved through familiar tasks while her mind raced ahead, trying to calculate how long before it became visible, how long before she had to make decisions, how long before the town noticed and the whispers became shouts. She was sitting at her kitchen table staring at nothing when she heard Elias's wagon. Panic seized her throat. She wasn't ready, hadn't prepared what to say, how to act, whether to tell him now or wait, or maybe never tell him at all and just let him discover it when everyone else did. But the wagon was already stopping outside, and Elias was already climbing down, and Clara had no choice but to open the door when he knocked. "Morning," he said, holding up a canvas sack. "Brought salt pork from town. Figured we could—" He stopped, his eyes sharpening as he studied her face. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. I'm fine." "You're a terrible liar." He stepped inside without invitation, setting the sack on the table and turning to face her fully. "What happened?" Clara opened her mouth to deflect again, but the words wouldn't come. She'd spent 2 years lying to herself about how fine she was, how well she was coping, how little she needed from anyone. She was so tired of lying, but this truth was too big, too dangerous. She couldn't just speak it aloud. "I need to show you something," she heard herself say. "In the garden." Elias frowned but followed her outside. The garden was dormant now, just dark soil and dead stalks waiting for spring, but Clara led him to the far corner where 2 small wooden crosses stood side by side. She'd carved them herself from pine, had burned the names into the wood with a heated poker because she couldn't afford a proper stonemason. William Whitmore, 1849 to 1881. Grace Whitmore, 1875 to 1881. "I know about your family," Elias said quietly. "Everyone knows." "Do you know how William died?" Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. "Logging accident. Tree fell wrong." "Yes. September 15th, 1881, more than 2 years ago." She paused, gathering courage. "Do you know when Grace died?" "That spring before. Scarlet fever." March 23rd, 1881. Clara wrapped her arms around herself against the cold. 6 months between them. 6 months where I was both a widow and a mother. 6 months of trying to keep going for Grace's sake, of pretending her father was just away working, of lying to a 6-year-old about why her papa wasn't coming home. Clara. And then she got sick. The words came faster now, like poison being drawn from a wound. So fast. One day she was fine, playing with her doll. The next she was burning with fever. I tried everything. Cool cloths, willow bark tea, prayers. Nothing worked. She died in my arms 3 days later, calling for her father. Elias stood silent, his face grave. "After that I wanted to die too." Clara's voice cracked. "For months I wished every morning that I just wouldn't wake up, that I could follow them and not have to keep surviving. But my body wouldn't cooperate. It just kept breathing, kept moving, kept existing even though I didn't want it to." She turned to face him fully and saw understanding dawn in his dark eyes before she even said the words. "I'm pregnant, Elias." The silence that followed was so complete that Clara could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the wind moving through the pine trees, could hear the world continuing to turn despite the fact that hers had just stopped. Elias's face went carefully blank, the way faces do when people are trying to process something that doesn't make sense. "You're... how far along?" 4 months. Maybe a little more." His eyes dropped to her stomach, still flat under her heavy dress and apron, then back to her face. "William's child." "Yes." The word came out fierce, defensive. "From before he died. I didn't know. I thought, after Grace died, I wasn't eating well, wasn't sleeping. My courses stopped and I just assumed it was grief. But then they never came back and I started feeling sick in the mornings. She stopped, swallowing hard. "I only realized for certain a few days ago." Elias took a step back, his hand coming up to run through his hair. It was the most unsettled Clara had ever seen him, and fear twisted in her gut. This was it. The moment he walked away. The moment she lost the one good thing that had come into her life in 2 years. Why are you telling me this? His voice was rough, strained. Because I don't know what to do. The confession tumbled out. Because the whole town is already talking about us. And when they see I'm pregnant, they're going to assume it's yours. And you're going to be dragged into a scandal that has nothing to do with you. Because I'm terrified. And I have no one else to tell. You could have hidden it from me. For how long? Until it became obvious, until everyone was talking about it and you heard it from someone else? Clara shook her head. You've been honest with me from the start. I owed you the same. Elias turned away, staring out at the mountains rising in the distance. Clara watched the muscles in his jaw work, watched him process information that she knew must feel like a betrayal, even though she'd done nothing wrong. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. What do you want from me? The question felt like a knife. Nothing. I'm not asking you for anything. I thought you should know. Before everyone else figures it out. Before the gossip starts. The gossip already started the night I bought your basket. He turned back to face her, and his expression was unreadable. This will just give them better material. I know, and I'm sorry. I never meant to drag you into this. Into what? Your life? Something flickered across his face. Anger, maybe, or hurt. You think I've been coming here because I felt sorry for you? Fixing your porch and your fences out of charity? I don't know why you've been coming here, Clara said honestly. You said it wasn't courtship. You said we were just friends. People helping each other. And now you're pregnant with another man's child. He said it flatly, as if testing how the word sounded. Your dead husband's child. Yes. And when the town sees, they're going to assume the worst. Yes. They're going to call you a whore. They're going to say you and I have been... He stopped, seeming unable to finish the sentence. Yes? Clara's voice was barely audible. And they're going to call you worse things. For being involved with me. For being seen with me. For whatever they think we've been doing. Elias was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something distant. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Not angry or hurt, but considering. Tell me something. When were you planning to tell them the truth? About when the child was conceived? I don't know if they'd believe me. That's not what I asked. Would you tell them? Clara thought about that. About standing in front of the town and explaining that she was pregnant with her husband's child despite him being dead for over 2 years. About the mathematics they'd do, the eyebrows they'd raise, the skepticism they'd voice. About how easily they'd dismiss her story as a convenient lie. I'd try, she said finally, but I don't think it would matter. They've already decided who I am. Then what's your plan? Have the baby and raise it alone while everyone whispers? I don't have a plan. The admission felt like defeat. I can barely keep myself fed and sheltered. How am I supposed to raise a child? How am I supposed to work when I'm heavily pregnant? How am I supposed to... She stopped, her throat closing around tears she refused to shed. Elias stepped closer, and for a wild moment Clara thought he might embrace her. But he stopped just out of reach, his expression still unreadable. You asked me once how I kept going after Anne and the baby died. You remember what I told you? That you didn't have a choice. That your body kept waking up. That's part of it. But there's more. He paused. I also told myself that Anne wouldn't have wanted me to die with her. That she'd have wanted me to live, even if living hurt, even if it meant being alone. Clara didn't understand where this was going, but she waited. This child, Elias continued, is William's legacy. Part of him that's still here, still alive. You really think he'd want you to face this alone? To struggle and suffer because you're too proud to accept help? It's not pride. It's exactly pride. The same kind that made you show up at that auction even though you knew no one would bid. The same kind that keeps you from asking for help even when you're drowning. His voice softened slightly. But pride doesn't keep children fed, Clara. Pride doesn't rebuild barns or deliver babies or protect you from gossip. What are you saying? Elias took a breath and Clara saw something shift in his expression, a decision being made in real time. I'm saying that I lost a wife and a child, that I spent 15 years avoiding anything that might make me feel that kind of pain again, that I swore I'd never let myself care about anyone enough to be destroyed when they left. Clara's heart was pounding so hard she felt dizzy. And then I saw you standing in that hall with your basket, being treated like you were nothing, and something in me broke open. He met her eyes fully now, and what she saw there made her breath catch. These past weeks, coming here, working beside you, talking with you, it's been the closest thing to alive I've felt since Anne died. Elias, let me finish. His voice was firm but not unkind. I told you I wasn't courting you, that this was just friendship, and I meant it because I didn't think I could be anything else to anyone, but I was wrong. The world seemed to tilt slightly. Clara reached out to steady herself against the fence post. This child isn't mine, Elias continued, and I'm not William. I can't replace him, can't be what he was to you, but I can be something else. Someone who stands beside you, someone who helps raise this baby, someone who tells the town to go to hell when they start their gossip. Clara couldn't breathe, couldn't process what she was hearing. You're talking about marriage. I'm talking about choice. He stepped closer, close enough now that she could see the silver threading through his dark beard, the lines around his eyes, the scar on his left cheekbone she'd never asked about. I'm choosing to be here, not out of obligation, not out of pity, but because I want to be, because you're worth choosing. Tears were streaming down Clara's face now, hot against her cold cheeks. The town will say terrible things about both of us. They'll say I trapped you, that the baby is yours, that we've been lying all along. Let them say it. We'll know the truth. But you'll be bound to me, to a child that isn't yours, for the rest of your life. I'll be bound to a woman I respect more than anyone I've ever met, Elias corrected, to a child who needs a father, to a life that's bigger than my grief. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. I'm not asking you to love me, Clara. I'm not even asking you to want this. I'm just asking you to let me stand with you, to face whatever comes next together instead of alone. Clara stared at their joined hands, his scarred and calloused from years of hard work, hers smaller but equally worn. She thought about William, about the love they'd shared and lost. She thought about Grace, about the daughter she'd never stop grieving. She thought about the child growing inside her, William's last gift, precious and terrifying in equal measure. And she thought about Elias, this strange, solitary man who'd bought her basket when no one else would, who'd rebuilt her porch and her fences and somehow, piece by piece, had started rebuilding her too. I don't love you, she said, her voice breaking. I know. I still love William. I probably always will. I know that too. His grip on her hand tightened slightly. Anne's been gone 15 years and I still love her. Love doesn't die just because people do. But it also doesn't mean we can't build something new alongside it. What if I can't be a wife to you? Not in all the ways that means. Then we'll figure that out as we go. There's no rules that say a marriage has to look a certain way. He paused. Plenty of people marry for reasons that have nothing to do with romance. Land, money, companionship. Why can't we marry for survival and mutual respect? That sounds cold. It sounds honest. Elias studied her face. I'd rather have an honest partnership with you than a dishonest romance with anyone else. Clara closed her eyes, trying to think clearly through the chaos in her mind. This was insane. They barely knew each other. They'd only been, whatever they were, for a month. Marriage was supposed to be about love, about passion, about choosing someone because you couldn't imagine life without them. But she'd had that with William, and he was gone. And what Elias was offering wasn't a replacement for that. It was something entirely different. A partnership. An alliance. Two people who understood loss choosing to face the future together rather than alone. The baby, she said, opening her eyes. You'd claim it as yours? I'd claim it as ours. Yours and mine, regardless of who planted the seed. If we're married, I'm its father. That's how it works. People will count back. They'll realize the timeline doesn't match. So we tell them the baby came early, or we don't tell them anything at all. It's not their business. What if, Clara's voice dropped to a whisper, what if something goes wrong? What if I lose this baby like you lost yours? The pain that crossed Elias's face was sharp and immediate, but he didn't look away. Then we grieve together instead of separately. And at least the child will have had parents who wanted it, even if only for a little while. The simplicity of it, the raw honesty, broke something loose in Clara's chest. She'd been so afraid of burdening him, of trapping him, of making him responsible for her disasters. But he was choosing this. Eyes open, fully aware of the risks, he was choosing her. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this?" Elias was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "Because I'm tired of being alone. Because I see who you are underneath the grief and the fear, and I like what I see. Because that baby deserves to grow up with two parents who will fight for it." He paused. "And because when I bought your basket that night, it wasn't just to save you from embarrassment. It was because I saw someone worth knowing, and everything since has just confirmed that I was right." Clara realized she was still crying, tears making cold tracks down her face. But they weren't tears of despair anymore. They were something more complicated, grief and hope and terror and gratitude all mixed together in a knot she couldn't untangle. "If we do this," she said slowly, "if we marry, I need you to understand something." "What's that?" "I can't promise you happiness. I can't promise to be the wife you might have dreamed of. I'm broken in ways that might never heal, and this baby is going to make everything more complicated." She swallowed hard. "But I can promise honesty, loyalty, respect, and I can promise to try. To build something with you that's real, even if it's not conventional. That's all I'm asking for." "Then yes." The word came out stronger than she expected. "Yes, I'll marry you." Something shifted in Elias's expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening, a settling, like a puzzle piece finding its place. He raised her hand and pressed it briefly to his lips, a gesture that was formal and oddly old-fashioned and entirely appropriate. "We should do it soon," he said practically. "Before you start showing. Less ammunition for gossip." "How soon?" "End of the week if we can arrange it. I'll talk to Pastor Williams tomorrow." Clara nodded, her mind already racing ahead. "People are going to ask questions. Why the rush? Why now?" "Let them ask. We don't owe them answers." He released her hand and stepped back, becoming businesslike. "You'll need to pack your things. Move up to my place, unless you'd rather I move here. Your cabin is bigger, better built." Clara looked around at her small homestead, at the place she'd shared with William and Grace. Leaving it felt like abandoning their ghosts, but staying felt like clinging to a past she could no longer inhabit. "I'll bring what I need. We'll bring everything you want, furniture, belongings, anything that matters." Elias paused. "This is your home too, our home. You get to shape it however you need to." The kindness of it, the thoughtfulness, made Clara's throat tight again. "I don't know how to do this. How to be married to someone I'm not in love with." "Neither do I. We'll figure it out as we go." He turned toward the house, then stopped. "Clara?" "Yes?" "That child you're carrying, William's child. I'm going to love it. I want you to know that. Not as a substitute for the one I lost, but as its own person. Our child, regardless of blood." Clara pressed her hand to her stomach, to the small life growing there that she'd been too terrified to acknowledge as real. "I believe you." "Good. Because we're going to need to tell people soon, and I want us to be united when we do. No cracks they can exploit." "When should we tell them? About the baby?" Elias considered. "After the wedding, once you're legally my wife, then it's just an announcement, not a scandal. They'll still count back, still speculate. Let them. We'll have each other to weather it." He reached the door and turned back one more time. "You should rest. This has been a hell of a morning. I'll come back tomorrow with details about the wedding." Clara watched him leave, watched his wagon roll down the path and disappear around the bend. Then she sank onto her new porch steps, the ones he'd built just weeks ago, and let the reality of what had just happened wash over her. She was getting married, to a man she'd known for barely a month, a man who was agreeing to raise another man's child as his own, a man who'd looked at her pregnant, terrified, and drowning, and had chosen to dive in anyway. It wasn't a fairy tale, it wasn't a love story, at least not the kind she'd had with William, but it was real, solid. Two people making a deliberate choice to face the world together rather than alone. And maybe, Clara thought as she finally stood and went inside to stare at the belongings she'd need to pack, Maybe that was enough. Maybe survival and partnership and mutual respect were their own kind of love. Different from romance, but no less valuable. She had 3 days to prepare. 3 days before she became Clara Crow, before her life changed irrevocably, before the town learned the truth and passed their judgment. 3 days to say goodbye to the woman she'd been and prepare to become whoever she was going to be next. But for now, in this moment, Clara allowed herself to feel something she hadn't felt in over 2 years. Not happiness exactly, not joy, but something close to hope. The tiniest ember of it, fragile as a candle flame in wind, but burning nonetheless. She was going to survive this, she and Elias and the child she carried. They were going to build something that looked nothing like what she'd lost, but might still be worth having. And when the town came with their whispers and accusations and judgment, they'd face it together. That had to be enough. It would have to be. The wedding took place on a gray Saturday morning, 4 days after Clara had told Elias about the baby. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony in his small office, rather than the church, with only his wife Margaret as witness. The pastor had asked few questions when Elias came to make the arrangements, though his eyebrows had risen at the speed of it all. But Elias had paid him well, and spoken with such quiet certainty that Williams had simply nodded and scheduled them for the earliest available time. Clara wore the same blue wool dress she'd worn to the auction, freshly pressed, and with a sprig of dried lavender pinned at the collar, the only concession to ceremony she could manage. Elias wore a clean shirt and his best coat, his beard freshly trimmed, his dark hair combed back though it kept falling forward. They stood side by side before the pastor, their hands joined and spoke vows that felt both momentous and surreal. I, Clara Ann Whitmore, take you, Elias John Crow, to be my lawfully wedded husband. The words felt strange in her mouth. Not wrong, exactly, but weighted with implications she was still trying to understand. This was nothing like her wedding to William, which had been full of flowers and music and her mother crying happy tears in the front pew. This was practical, stripped down to its essential elements. 2 people making a legal commitment, witnessed and recorded, binding them together in the eyes of the law and the town. I, Elias John Crow, take you, Clara Ann Whitmore, to be my lawfully wedded wife. Elias's voice was steady, his grip on her hand firm. When Pastor Williams instructed him to kiss his bride, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead instead of her mouth, a gesture that felt more protective than romantic, and somehow exactly right. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Williams intoned. May you find peace and partnership together. Peace and partnership, not love and happiness. Clara wondered if the pastor had chosen those words deliberately, or if he simply sensed that this marriage was built on different foundations than most. They signed the register, Margaret Williams adding her name as witness with a smile that seemed genuinely warm. Congratulations, she said quietly to Clara. I hope you'll both be very happy. Thank you, Clara managed, though happy felt like the wrong aspiration. Safe, maybe. Stable. Surviving. Elias paid the pastor, shook his hand, and guided Clara outside with a hand at the small of her back. His wagon waited where he'd left it, already loaded with Clara's belongings, the furniture she'd insisted on bringing, the trunk of clothes, the boxes of dishes and linens and small treasures she couldn't bear to leave behind. He'd spent the previous 2 days helping her pack, moving through her cabin with quiet efficiency, wrapping her things carefully as if they were precious. You ready? He asked now, holding out his hand to help her onto the wagon seat. Clara looked back at the pastor's house, then beyond it to the town of Pine Hollow, spread out in the valley below. Somewhere down there, people were going about their Saturday routines, completely unaware that the widow everyone had shunned was now married to the mountain man everyone avoided. By tomorrow, word would spread. By next week, the entire county would know. As ready as I'll ever be, she said, and took his hand. The ride up to Elias's cabin took nearly an hour, following a rough track that wound through dense pine forest and across 2 rushing creeks. The elevation climbed steadily, the air growing sharper and colder, the silence deeper. Clara had never been this far up the mountain, had never seen where Elias lived his solitary life. As they rounded a final bend and the cabin came into view, she caught her breath. It was larger than she'd expected, built from huge logs chinked with careful precision. The roof was steeply pitched to shed snow, and a stone chimney rose from one end. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and behind the cabin she could see a barn, a smokehouse, and several smaller outbuildings. The whole place sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, with a view that stretched for miles down the valley toward Pine Hollow and the ranges beyond. "You built all this yourself?" Clara asked, awestruck. "Over the years, keeps me busy." Elias brought the wagon to a halt near the porch. "It's not fancy, but it's solid. Should be room enough for all of us." All of us. The phrase sent a flutter through Clara's stomach. She pressed her hand there, to the child that would make them a family of 3. Elias helped her down from the wagon and led her inside. The interior was as well built as the exterior, wide plank floors, a massive stone fireplace, sturdy furniture that looked handmade. There was one large main room that served as kitchen and living area, and 2 smaller rooms off to the sides. Everything was meticulously clean, organized with the precision of someone who'd lived alone and developed systems to maintain order. "That's my room," Elias said, gesturing to the room on the left. "Or was. Figured you'd want the larger one on the right, more windows, better light, and there's space for a cradle when the time comes." Clara walked to the doorway of what was now her room and looked inside. It was simply furnished with a bed, a dresser, and a chair, but someone, Elias, she realized, had placed a vase of dried wildflowers on the windowsill and laid a quilt across the bed. The quilt was beautiful, a pattern of blues and greens sewn with careful stitches. "That was Anne's," Elias said quietly from behind her. "She made it our first year of marriage. I've kept it all these years, but I thought you might want it. For warmth, if nothing else." Clara reached out and touched the fabric, feeling the history woven into every stitch. Another woman's hands had made this. Another woman who'd loved Elias, who'd built a life with him, who died before that life could fully bloom. It should have felt wrong to use it, like trespassing on sacred ground. Instead, it felt like being welcomed into something larger than herself. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you." They spent the rest of the day unloading the wagon and settling Clara's belongings into the cabin. Elias made space for her things without being asked, moving his own possessions to make room for hers. Her dishes joined his in the kitchen. Her books went onto the shelf by the fireplace. The photographs she'd brought, William and Grace, her parents, the small daguerreotype of William's family, were given places of honor rather than being hidden away. "They're part of your story," Elias said when Clara hesitated over where to put them. "No reason to pretend otherwise." As the afternoon faded into evening, Elias built up the fire and made dinner, venison stew and cornbread that was surprisingly good. They ate at the table by the window, watching the last light fade from the valley below. The silence between them was comfortable, familiar after weeks of shared meals. But there was a new awareness, too. This was their home now, their life. The beginning of something that neither of them quite knew how to navigate. "I'll sleep in the other room," Elias said as they cleaned up after dinner. "Want you to know that right away. No expectations, no pressure. We'll figure out the rest as we go." Clara felt relief wash over her, followed immediately by something else. Gratitude, maybe, or the deepening of respect that had been growing since that first night on the porch. "Thank you for understanding. We're partners, Clara. That means we talk about things. We decide together, and we respect each other's boundaries." He dried the last plate and set it carefully in the cupboard. "I meant what I said about this being a real marriage, but real doesn't have to mean conventional." That night, Clara lay in her new bed under Anne's quilt and listened to the sounds of the cabin settling, the wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl. Through the wall, she could hear Elias moving in his own room, the creak of floorboards, the soft sounds of someone preparing for sleep. She was married, to a man she barely knew, carrying a child by her first husband, living in a cabin on a mountain far from everything familiar. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt something unexpected, a fragile kind of peace, as if for the first time in 2 years she wasn't fighting just to survive. She was building something, with someone who understood loss and wouldn't expect her to be anything other than what she was. Sunday morning arrived cold and bright. Elias rose early and made coffee, and they sat together on the porch, watching the sun climb over the eastern peaks. The beauty of it was almost painful, the world painted in shades of gold and pink, the valley below still deep in shadow, the silence so complete it felt holy. "We need to go to town today," Elias said, breaking the quiet. "Let people see us together, announce the marriage properly." Clara's stomach clenched. She'd known this was coming, but knowing didn't make it easier. They're going to react badly. Probably, but better to control the narrative than let them write it for us. He glanced at her. "We tell them simple truth. We married yesterday. We're building a life together. That's all they need to know. And when I start showing, we tell them you're expecting our child, conceived in our marriage. The dates don't matter. Babies come when they come. They'll count back. They'll know the timeline is impossible. Let them count." Elias's voice was firm. "What are they going to do? Accuse us of lying? Demand proof? They've got no right to our private business." Clara drew in a shaky breath. "I'm afraid." "So am I." The admission surprised her, and he smiled slightly at her expression. "I'm not immune to fear, Clara. I just don't let it make my decisions for me. And right now the decision is to face them together, show them we're united, that we don't need their approval or their blessing." They dressed carefully, Clara in her best dress despite the wear showing at the seams, Elias in the same coat he'd worn for the wedding. The ride down the mountain felt both too long and too short, Clara's anxiety building with every turn of the wheels. By the time they reached Pine Hollow's main street, her hands were trembling so badly she had to clasp them in her lap to still them. It was Sunday, which meant church had just let out. The street was crowded with people in their Sunday best, families gathering to chat before heading home for midday dinner. Elias drove the wagon straight down the center of it all, making no attempt to avoid attention. The reactions were immediate and dramatic. Sarah Mitchell saw them first and her mouth dropped open. She grabbed her mother's arm, pointing. Martha Peterson turned, her face cycling through shock, disbelief, and something that might have been anger. Within seconds, it felt like every eye in Pine Hollow was fixed on the wagon, on Clara sitting beside Elias with her head held high, despite the terror churning in her gut. Elias brought the wagon to a halt outside the general store and climbed down, then came around to help Clara. She took his hand, acutely aware of how many people were watching, and stepped down onto the street. Vernon Hughes, the auctioneer, was the first to approach. "Mr. Crow, Mrs. Whitmore, didn't expect to see you both in town today." "It's Mrs. Crow now," Elias said evenly. "We were married yesterday." The silence that fell was so absolute that Clara could hear a dog barking somewhere blocks away. Vernon's eyes went wide, his gaze darting between them as if trying to reconcile what he was hearing with what he was seeing. "Married," he repeated. "You and Mrs. Crow were married. Yesterday." "That's correct." Elias kept his voice level, matter of fact. "Pastor Williams performed the ceremony. It's all legal and recorded." The crowd was gathering closer now, drawn by shock and curiosity. Clara could see faces she recognized, women who'd crossed the street to avoid her, men who'd refused to bid on her basket. The families she'd once considered friends before tragedy had made her untouchable. All of them staring, whispering behind raised hands, their expressions ranging from scandalized to fascinated. "But this is so sudden," Martha Peterson said, pushing to the front of the crowd. "You barely know each other. Why would you—" She stopped, her eyes dropping to Clara's stomach with naked calculation. Clara felt Elias tense beside her, but his voice remained calm. "We know each other well enough, and frankly, Mrs. Peterson, our reasons are our own business." "It's the town's business when one of our widows marries in secret," Martha countered. "People will talk. They'll wonder what you're hiding." "Let them wonder," Clara heard herself say. Her voice came out stronger than she felt. "Elias and I have made a commitment to each other. That's all anyone needs to know." "But the propriety of it," another woman chimed in, Harriet Mills, who'd apologized to Clara just weeks before. "The speed of it. It doesn't look right. Since when has this town cared about my propriety?" Clara's fear was transforming into something harder, sharper. "You all decided I was improper the moment I failed to grieve on your preferred schedule. You shunned me, whispered about me, treated me like I was cursed, and now you're concerned about the optics of my marriage. Several people had the grace to look ashamed, But Martha Peterson's chin lifted defiantly. We were looking out for you, trying to protect you from making poor choices in your vulnerable state. By leaving me completely alone? Clara's voice rose. By letting my basket sit unbid while you congratulated yourselves on your charity? That was protection? Clara, Elias said quietly, his hand finding hers. She looked at him and saw understanding in his eyes, but also caution. Getting into a shouting match with the town wouldn't help anything. She drew a breath, forcing herself to calm down. My husband and I, she said, emphasizing the word deliberately, are here to inform you of our marriage and to pick up some supplies. We're not asking for your blessing or your approval. We're simply living our lives, the same courtesy we'd extend to any of you. This isn't over, Martha said, her voice tight with something that sounded like frustration. There are questions that need answering, about the timing, about your intentions, about what exactly? Elias's voice cut through hers like a blade. About why I'd choose to marry Clara? Because I'll tell you right now, Mrs. Peterson, I married her because she's the finest woman I've ever met. Strong, capable, honest, and brave enough to keep standing after this town tried its damnedest to knock her down. If you're wondering what I see in her, that's your answer. The words rang out across the silent street, and Clara felt her throat close with emotion. Because he'd said it in front of everyone, had defended her publicly, without hesitation, staking his reputation on hers. Martha seemed at a loss for words. Vernon coughed uncomfortably. The crowd shifted and murmured, uncertain how to proceed. Then, unexpectedly, a voice spoke up from the back. I think it's wonderful. Everyone turned. Harriet Mills was pushing forward, her face set with determination. I think it's wonderful that Clara found someone who sees her worth, that she's not alone anymore. And I think the rest of you should be ashamed of yourselves for treating this like a scandal instead of a blessing. Harriet, Martha started. No, Martha, I'm done. Harriet moved to stand beside Clara, a gesture of solidarity that made Clara's eyes burn with tears. This town failed Clara when she needed us most. We pushed her away, made her feel unwelcome, turned grief into isolation. If she's found happiness with Mr. Crow, we should be celebrating, not interrogating. It's not about happiness, someone else said. It's about what's right, what's proper. Proper? Another voice joined in, old widow Hartley, the woman whose basket had sold at the auction despite her age. She stepped forward with her cane tapping the ground. You want to talk about proper? I'll tell you what's proper. A man taking responsibility. A woman finding security. Two people making a commitment to face life together. That's more proper than half the marriages in this town that started with romance and ended in misery. More voices erupted then, some supportive, some critical, the crowd fracturing into arguments and debates. Clara stood in the center of it all, Elias solid beside her, Harriet Mills on her other side, and felt the weight of 2 years of judgment beginning to crack. They weren't all convinced. Many still looked skeptical, suspicious, ready to pounce on any evidence of impropriety. But some, a meaningful number, were looking at Clara differently now, seeing her not as the cursed widow, but as a woman who'd survived and found a way forward. We're going to the mercantile now, Elias said, his voice cutting through the noise. Anyone who has genuine congratulations to offer will accept them. Anyone who wants to gossip and speculate can do it elsewhere. He guided Clara through the crowd, which parted reluctantly. Harriet followed, as did Widow Hartley and a few others. Inside the mercantile, Mr. Peterson hurried to serve them, his earlier shock giving way to practical merchant instincts. Congratulations on your marriage, he said, though his eyes kept darting to Clara's midsection. What can I get for you today? They purchased flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples, conducting the transaction with careful normalcy. The small group of supportive women lingered, making small talk, asking polite questions about where they'd live and what their plans were. Clara answered carefully, giving just enough information to satisfy curiosity without revealing anything private. When they finally left the mercantile, arms full of packages, the crowd outside had thinned but not dispersed. People were still talking in tight clusters, still watching. Elias loaded the supplies into the wagon with calm efficiency, then helped Clara up onto the seat. That went better than I expected, he murmured. Half of them think we're lying. Only half. The other half is willing to give us a chance. He climbed up beside her and took the reins. That's more than we had this morning. As they drove out of town, Clara looked back and saw Harriet Mills waving, Widow Hartley nodding approval. But she also saw Martha Peterson standing with her arms crossed, saw the calculating looks on other faces, saw the way some people were already hurrying off to spread the news to those who'd missed the confrontation. "They're going to be watching us," she said quietly, "counting days, waiting for proof that we're lying about when the baby was conceived." "Let them watch." Elias's jaw was set. "We'll keep living our lives, treating each other with respect, building something real. Eventually, most of them will lose interest in our business. And the ones who don't? We'll deal with them as they come." He glanced at her. "You did well back there, standing up for yourself." "I was terrified." "Bravery isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite it." He paused. "I meant what I said about why I married you. You know that, right?" Clara nodded, not trusting her voice, because she'd heard the truth in his words, had seen the conviction in his eyes when he defended her to the whole town. This marriage might have started as a practical arrangement, but it was already becoming something more complex. Not romance, perhaps, but something equally valuable: true partnership. The ride back up the mountain felt different than the ride down. The same landscape, the same wagon, but everything changed by what they'd just done. They'd declared themselves to Pine Hollow, drawn a line in the sand. From this point forward, they were Elias and Clara Crowe, married in the eyes of the law and the community, bound together by choice and necessity in equal measure. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Clara finally asked the question that had been building all day. "What happens when the baby comes? When it's obvious it's full term but only 7 months after we married?" Elias was whittling a piece of wood, shaping what looked like a small animal. He didn't look up from his work. "We say babies come when they're ready, that this one came a bit early but healthy. They'll know we're lying. They'll suspect. That's different from knowing." He tested the curve of the wood with his thumb. "And even if they're certain, what can they do? The baby will be legally mine, born in wedlock. Anything they say is just speculation. It'll follow the child. People will whisper. People always whisper. That's what people do." He finally looked up at her. "But this child will have 2 parents who chose to raise it, who'll protect it, who'll teach it that gossip says more about the gossipers than the subject. That's more than a lot of children get." Clara placed her hand on her stomach, feeling the small flutter that had started in recent days, the baby moving, growing, becoming real. "I want to tell them the truth about William, about when it was conceived. You can try, but are you prepared for them not to believe you?" She thought about that, about standing before the town and explaining that this child was her late husband's, conceived before his death despite him being gone for over 2 years, about the skepticism she'd face, the eyebrows that would raise, the calculations that would prove the story impossible by conventional timelines. "I conceived in October," she said slowly. "William died in September of 1881. That's over 2 years ago. No one's going to believe I'm carrying a child conceived that long ago." Elias set down his whittling. "Unless you tell them a different truth, that you and William were together in the months before he died, that you didn't realize you were pregnant until recently because of stress and grief. But that's still impossible. Grace died in March of 1881, William in September. I couldn't have been pregnant during that time without knowing." "Actually," Elias said carefully, "you could tell them you conceived just before William's accident, October of 1883, not 1881. Clara stared at him, understanding dawning. "You want me to lie about when he died?" "I want you to tell a version of the truth that they'll accept." He leaned forward, his expression serious. "Look, we both know the real timeline. We both know this is William's child, but the town doesn't need every detail. They just need a story that makes sense to them, one that protects you and protects the baby. But it's dishonoring William's memory, pretending he died more recently than he did. Is it dishonoring him, or is it protecting his child from a lifetime of whispers and speculation?" Elias's voice was gentle but firm. "William's gone, Clara. His memory lives in you, in this baby, in the way you carry forward. But his child needs to survive in this world, with these people, And if a small adjustment to the timeline makes that possible, is that really so wrong? Clara felt torn, caught between honesty and practicality. Everything in her wanted to tell the complete truth, to honor William's actual death date, to acknowledge the full weight of the time she'd spent grieving. But Elias was right. The baby's future mattered more than perfect accuracy in a story the town had no right to anyway. "I don't know if I can lie that convincingly," she said finally. "You don't have to lie. Just don't correct their assumptions." He picked up his whittling again. "When the time comes, we announce you're expecting. We're happy about it. If anyone asks about dates, we say the baby's coming in the spring," which is true. If they do their own math and decide it must have been conceived shortly after our marriage, we don't argue with them. And if somehow the topic of William comes up, you can say truthfully that this baby is his legacy, conceived in love. It was a careful dance around the truth, and Clara wasn't sure she was capable of it, but she was learning that survival sometimes required flexibility, that protecting those you loved might mean accepting versions of truth that were simpler, if not entirely complete. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's all I ask." Elias held up the small carving he'd been working on, a rabbit, she saw now, with delicate ears and careful detail. For the baby, figured every child should have a toy their father made. The gesture, simple and thoughtful, made Clara's throat tight. "You're going to be a good father." "I'm going to try." He set the rabbit carefully on the mantel. "That's all any of us can do." That night, Clara lay in bed listening to the wind and thought about the day, about standing in front of the town and claiming her marriage, about the way Elias had defended her without hesitation, about the women who'd stepped forward in support and the ones who hadn't, about the child growing inside her and the future they were all building together. She'd survived the first test, faced Pine Hollow as a married woman, and lived to tell about it. There would be more tests to come, the announcement of the pregnancy, the birth itself, the years of raising a child under the town's watchful eyes. But she wouldn't face them alone. Elias was in the next room, already becoming part of her daily rhythm. Not William, not a replacement, but someone solid and real, who'd chosen to stand beside her when everyone else had turned away. It wasn't the life she'd imagined, but it was the life she had. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Clara thought it might actually be enough. Winter gave way to early spring with a slowness that felt almost deliberate, as if the mountains themselves were taking time to adjust to the changes happening within the cabin on the ridge. Clara's belly grew rounder with each passing week, no longer something she could hide beneath loose clothing. By late February, there was no denying her condition to anyone who looked. The announcement came on a cold Sunday in early March, nearly 3 months after the wedding. Elias and Clara drove down to town together, as had become their routine, her hand resting on the swell of her stomach in a gesture that was becoming unconscious. They knew the whispers had already started, people had eyes, and Clara's changing shape hadn't gone unnoticed during their previous visits. But there was a difference between speculation and confirmation. They made the announcement simply, standing in the general store where they knew word would spread fastest. "We wanted you all to know," Elias said, his arm steady around Clara's shoulders, "that we're expecting a child. Come late May or early June, we'll be parents." The reactions were exactly what Clara had anticipated. Martha Peterson's eyes immediately began calculating, her lips moving as she counted back months. Sarah Mitchell looked confused, then shocked, then oddly pleased in a way that suggested she enjoyed being part of a scandal. But Harriet Mills, who'd stood by Clara in the street months ago, simply smiled and said, "Congratulations, that's wonderful news." "Awful quick, isn't it?" Martha couldn't help herself. "You only married in December." "Babies come on their own schedule," Elias replied evenly. "We're grateful either way." "But surely," Martha started, then caught herself as several other women shot her warning looks. Even she seemed to recognize there was a line between curiosity and outright rudeness. Widow Hartley stepped forward with her cane, her old eyes sharp and knowing. "A child is a blessing whenever it comes. I'm sure you'll both make fine parents." She paused, then added pointedly, "Better parents than some who've had all the time in the world to prepare and still failed their children through neglect or cruelty." The rebuke was clear, and Martha flushed red. But before she could respond, Harriet spoke up. I'd like to help prepare for the baby, if you'll let me, Clara. I still have some things from when my children were small, blankets and gowns that are just sitting in my attic. That's very kind, Clara said, genuinely touched. I'd appreciate it. Other women began chiming in then, offers of help, advice, hand-me-down items. Not everyone, and not with unanimous warmth, but enough that Clara felt the tide shifting slightly in their favor. The town might suspect the timeline didn't quite add up, but they were choosing, most of them, to accept the surface explanation rather than push for uncomfortable truths. As they left town that day, supplies loaded and well wishes still ringing in their ears, Clara felt something loosen in her chest. We did it, she said quietly. We told them, and the world didn't end. Told you they'd accept what we gave them. Elias guided the wagon around a muddy patch in the road. Martha Peterson's going to count on her fingers for weeks, but she can't prove anything. And the others are choosing kindness over suspicion. Not all of them. No. But enough. He glanced at her, his expression softening. How are you feeling? Really? Clara considered the question. Physically, she was tired more easily now. Her back ached, and the baby's movements sometimes woke her at night. But emotionally? Scared, she admitted. The birth is coming, and I keep thinking about Grace, about how sick she got, how quickly I lost her. What if something goes wrong with this baby? Then we'll deal with it. Elias's voice was steady, but not dismissive. But worrying about what might happen doesn't change what will happen. All we can do is prepare the best we can. You sound very calm about it. I'm terrified, he said bluntly, every day. But I learned a long time ago that fear doesn't change outcomes. Action does. So I'm making sure we have everything we need, supplies, a midwife lined up, plans for different possibilities. That's all I can control. The midwife he'd arranged was a woman named Ruth Carson, who lived halfway between Pine Hollow and the mountain cabin. She was experienced, practical, and didn't ask uncomfortable questions about timelines when she came to examine Clara in late March. She simply assessed the baby's position, declared everything looked healthy, and told Clara to send for her when the pain started. First babies can take their time, Ruth said, packing up her bag. Could be hours, could be a full day. Don't panic. Your body knows what to do, even if your mind doesn't trust it yet. After she left, Clara stood by the window looking out at the mountains still capped with snow. My body didn't know how to save Grace. Elias came up behind her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel his presence. Grace had scarlet fever. That's not something a body can fight off with knowing. This is different. Is it? Women die in childbirth all the time. You lost Anne that way. The words hung heavy between them. Elias was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice was rough with old pain. I did. And I won't lie to you and say it's not possible, but Anne had complications we didn't know about until it was too late. Ruth says you're healthy, the baby's positioned well, everything looks as it should. Those are good signs. But not guarantees. No, not guarantees. He moved to stand beside her, looking out at the same view. But I'm not going to lose you, Clara. I lost Anne because I didn't know what to watch for, because the midwife we had wasn't experienced enough, because we were young and stupid and thought love would be enough. I know better now. And I'm going to be right there with you, every step of the way. Clara turned to look at him, this man who'd become her husband in every practical sense, even if their marriage remained unconsummated. Over the past months, they'd built a rhythm together, working side by side during the day, sharing meals and conversation in the evenings, sleeping in separate rooms but living in genuine partnership. It wasn't romance, but it was real, solid, the kind of foundation that could support a family. I'm glad you're here, she said quietly. I don't think I could do this alone. You won't have to. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and rested his hand on her swollen belly. The baby kicked immediately, a strong thump against his palm, and his eyes widened. Is it always that strong? Clara smiled despite her fear. Getting stronger every day. I think we're going to have a fighter. Good. Fighters survive. His hand stayed where it was, warm and steady. This baby's going to have everything we can give it. Love, protection, a home. That's more than either of us had at the end. The spring advanced quickly once it truly began. Snow melted from all but the highest peaks, revealing meadows thick with wildflowers. Clara's garden, which Elias had helped her plant in careful rows, began to sprout green shoots. The world was renewing itself, and Clara felt her own body moving toward its own renewal, or completion, depending on how you looked at it. The pains started on a warm evening in late May, just as the sun was setting behind the western peaks. Clara had been folding laundry when the first contraction hit, a tightening across her belly that made her gasp and sit down hard on the nearest chair. Elias looked up from where he was oiling a harness. "Clara?" "I think it's starting." Her voice came out breathier than she intended. "The baby's coming." He was on his feet immediately, moving with the calm efficiency she'd learned to expect in crisis. "How far apart are the pains?" "That was the first one. I don't—" Another contraction cut her off, and she gripped the edge of the table. "Maybe not the first. I've been feeling tightness all day, but I thought it was just the baby moving." Elias was already pulling on his boots. "I'm going for Ruth. She said 2 hours ride if I push it. Can you manage that long?" Clara nodded, though fear was starting to spiral in her chest. This was it. After 9 months of carrying William's child, of hiding it and protecting it and building a life that could support it, the moment had arrived. "Don't leave yet," she said as another contraction hit. "Stay for just a minute. Please." He came to her immediately, kneeling beside her chair and taking her hands. "I'm here. I'm right here." "What if something goes wrong? What if I—" "Nothing's going to go wrong." His voice was firm, his grip strong. "You're strong, Clara, stronger than you know. And I'm going to get Ruth, and she's going to help you bring this baby into the world safely. You trust me?" She looked into his eyes, those dark, steady eyes that had seen her at her worst and chosen to stay anyway, and found herself nodding. "I trust you." "Then hold on. I'll be back before you know it." He kissed her forehead, a gesture that had become familiar over the months, and was gone. Clara heard the barn door slam, heard hoofbeats thundering down the mountain path, and then she was alone with the contractions that were coming faster now, harder, transforming her body into something she didn't recognize. She labored through the evening in a haze of pain and determination, walking when she could, leaning against furniture when she couldn't, breathing through each wave as it crested and broke. The cabin grew dark around her, and she lit lamps with shaking hands, needing the light to hold back the fear that kept threatening to overwhelm her. What if the baby was positioned wrong? What if it was too big? What if her body, which had already failed to save her daughter, failed again? The questions circled like vultures, and Clara had to fight to keep breathing, keep moving, keep trusting that Elias would return with help. He burst through the door perhaps 90 minutes later, Ruth Carson right behind him. The midwife took one look at Clara and immediately began issuing calm instructions. "Good. You're walking. That helps. How close are the pains?" "Close," Clara gasped. "Maybe every few minutes." "All right, let's get you to the bedroom. Elias, I need water boiling, clean linens, and then you're going to help me." If Ruth found it unusual for a husband to be present during birth, she didn't mention it. She simply organized them both like soldiers in a campaign, and Clara found comfort in the structure, the clear directions, the sense that someone competent was in charge. The labor intensified as the night deepened. Clara lost track of time, aware only of the relentless contractions, Ruth's steady voice guiding her, and Elias's hand gripping hers whenever she reached for him. At some point she started crying, not from the pain, though that was immense, but from fear that this was where it would end. That she'd come so far only to die like Anne had, leaving Elias alone again, leaving the baby without a mother. "I can't," she sobbed during a particularly brutal contraction. "I can't do this." "You are doing this." Ruth's voice was firm. "You're almost there, Clara. The baby's coming. I can see the head." "You're so strong," Elias said, his face close to hers, his hand steady despite the crushing grip she had on it. "Just a little more. Stay with me." The urge to push became overwhelming, and Clara stopped fighting her body's instincts. Ruth guided her through it, telling her when to push and when to breathe, and Elias stayed beside her the entire time, murmuring encouragement even though she could see fear in his eyes. And then, in a rush of sensation that felt like being torn apart and remade simultaneously, the baby came. The cry that filled the cabin was strong and lusty, the sound of a healthy infant announcing its arrival. Clara collapsed back against the pillows, gasping, tears streaming down her face as Ruth worked quickly to clear the baby's airways and cut the cord. "It's a boy," Ruth announced, wrapping the baby in a clean blanket. "Strong lungs, good color. You've got yourself a fine son." A son. William's son. The legacy she'd carried and protected and feared for. Clara held out trembling arms, and Ruth placed the baby against her chest. He was red-faced and wrinkled, his hair dark and damp, his fists waving indignantly at the bright new world he'd entered. And he was perfect. "Hello, little one," Clara whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm your mother." And we made it. We both made it. Elias stood beside the bed, his hand covering his mouth, his eyes suspiciously bright. Clara looked up at him and saw everything he wasn't saying: relief, joy, grief for the child he'd lost, gratitude for this one who'd survived. "Do you want to hold him?" she asked softly. He nodded, unable to speak, and Ruth showed him how to support the baby's head as she transferred the tiny bundle into his large, scarred hands. The mountain man who trapped animals and felled trees and lived in self-imposed isolation stood holding a newborn with a gentleness that made Clara's heart ache. "He's beautiful," Elias managed finally. "Perfect." "What will you name him?" Ruth asked, working efficiently to clean up and check that Clara had no complications from the birth. Clara and Elias looked at each other. They'd discussed this in the abstract, but now, with the baby real and breathing and alive, the decision felt monumental. "Thomas," Clara said, the name coming to her with sudden certainty. "After my father, Thomas William Crow." "William," Elias repeated, understanding immediately. "For his real father." "Yes. So he carries both, the man who gave him life and the man who'll raise him." Clara's voice was firm. "Is that all right?" "It's perfect." Elias looked down at the baby, at Thomas, and something in his expression softened even further. "Thomas William Crow, welcome home, son." Ruth finished her work and declared both mother and baby healthy. She gave Clara instructions for nursing and care, told Elias to let Clara rest as much as possible, and promised to check on them in a few days. Then she collected her fee and headed back down the mountain, leaving the new family alone in the lamplight. Elias helped Clara get comfortable, brought her water and bread when she said she was starving, and sat beside the bed as she nursed Thomas for the first time. The baby latched on immediately, and Clara felt the primal satisfaction of her body doing what it was meant to do. "I was so afraid," she said quietly as Thomas nursed. "The whole pregnancy, I was terrified something would go wrong." "So was I." Elias's admission came easier now. "Every day, but he's here now, strong and healthy. Whatever comes next, we face it together." The words echoed what he'd said months ago when he'd proposed this arrangement, this partnership built on mutual loss and respect rather than romance. But things had changed since then. Clara looked at the man sitting beside her bed, who'd ridden through the night to fetch help, who'd held her hand through hours of labor, who was looking at another man's child with genuine love and commitment, and she realized that somewhere along the way, her feelings had shifted. She didn't love him the way she'd loved William, that passionate, youthful love that had burned bright and been extinguished too soon. But she loved him nonetheless, loved his steadiness, his honesty, his quiet strength, loved the way he'd chosen her when no one else would, loved that he was going to raise Thomas as his own without qualification or resentment. "Elias," she said softly. He looked up from watching Thomas. "Yes?" "Thank you for all of this, for choosing us." His throat worked, and he reached out to brush a strand of hair from her forehead. "Thank you for letting me." They sat in comfortable silence as Thomas finished nursing and fell asleep in Clara's arms. Elias took him gently and placed him in the cradle he'd built, sturdy pine with rockers he'd shaped by hand, lined with soft blankets that Harriet Mills and other women from town had contributed. Thomas settled immediately, his tiny chest rising and falling in the peaceful rhythm of infant sleep. "We should sleep too," Elias said. "You especially. You've been through hell tonight." But Clara caught his hand before he could leave. "Stay, just for a little while. I don't want to be alone yet." So he pulled the chair closer and sat holding her hand while she drifted toward sleep, exhausted and triumphant, and filled with a fragile hope she hadn't felt in years. She'd survived childbirth. Thomas had survived being born. They'd made it through the first impossible hurdle. The town's reaction to Thomas's birth was mixed, as expected. When Elias rode down to Pine Hollow a week later to announce the arrival of his son, he faced the same calculating looks, the same whispered conversations. But he also faced genuine congratulations from enough people that it mattered. "A boy," Widow Hartley said with satisfaction. "Good strong lungs, I heard from Ruth. That's excellent news." "Came a bit early, didn't he?" Martha Peterson couldn't resist. "You said June, but here it is still May." "Babies come when they're ready," Elias repeated the now familiar refrain. Thomas was ready. "And Clara? She's well?" "Tired but healthy. Ruth says everything went smoothly." The questions continued, probing and pointed, but Elias deflected them all with the same calm persistence he'd shown since the beginning. Yes, the baby was healthy. Yes, Clara was recovering. Yes, they were both grateful. No, they wouldn't be bringing the baby to town for a few weeks yet. Newborns needed quiet and protection from illness. But when Harriet Mills asked if she could visit to see the baby and help Clara, Elias agreed readily. And when several other women made similar requests, he accepted those too. Because isolation had nearly destroyed Clara once, and he wasn't going to let it happen again. The visitors started arriving within the week. Harriet came first, bringing a basket of food and staying to admire Thomas, to help Clara with household tasks, to provide the kind of companionship that came from another woman who'd survived childbirth and understood its aftermath. She asked no uncomfortable questions about timing, made no comments about Thomas's size or development that might suggest he was more mature than a supposedly premature baby should be. She simply cooed over him, helped Clara with nursing advice, and treated Elias with genuine warmth. Other women followed, not all, and not the ones who'd been most judgmental, but enough. Sarah Mitchell came shyly, bringing a knitted cap she'd made. Widow Hartley arrived with soup and stories about her own long-ago children. Even some women who'd previously avoided Clara showed up, drawn by curiosity but staying out of what seemed like genuine goodwill. And slowly, grudgingly, Pine Hollow began to accept the Crow family as legitimate. They might suspect the timeline was fudged. They might whisper that Thomas looked awfully robust for a premature baby. But without proof, and faced with a family that was clearly functioning and healthy, the gossip eventually lost its edge. By midsummer, when Thomas was 2 months old and thriving, Clara and Elias brought him to town for the first time. The response was warmer than Clara had dared hope. People stopped to admire the baby, to comment on his dark hair and strong grip, to offer congratulations that seemed mostly sincere. Martha Peterson still looked skeptical, but even she couldn't deny that Thomas was a beautiful baby, clearly well cared for and loved. "He has your eyes, Mr. Crow," she said, and Clara tensed, waiting for the accusation hidden in the observation. But Elias just smiled. "I'll take that as a compliment, and he has his mother's determination, which is going to serve him well." They were standing outside the mercantile, Thomas sleeping peacefully in Clara's arms, when Vernon Hughes approached. The auctioneer who'd watched Clara's basket go unbid was carrying a package wrapped in brown paper. "Mrs. Crow," he said, his tone formal but not unfriendly, "I wanted to give you this. For the baby." Clara unwrapped it to find a beautiful wooden rattle, carved with care and sanded smooth. "Mr. Hughes, this is lovely. Did you make this?" "I did." He looked uncomfortable but determined. "I've been wanting to say something for a while now. About the auction. About how this town treated you after your losses. It was wrong. I was wrong to let it happen. And I'm sorry." The apology, unexpected and public, made Clara's throat tight. "Thank you. That means more than you know. You've built a good life here." He gestured to include Elias and Thomas. "A good family. I'm glad things worked out for you." As he walked away, Clara looked up at Elias and saw the same emotion she was feeling reflected in his eyes. This was acceptance. Not universal, not complete, but real. The town that had shunned her was slowly, awkwardly making amends. The summer passed in a blur of new parenthood. Thomas grew quickly. his infant squalls giving way to coos and gurgles, his eyes tracking movement, his hands grasping at anything within reach. Clara navigated the challenges of nursing and sleepless nights with Elias's steady support. He would walk Thomas for hours when the baby was fussy, would change him without complaint, would sit up with Clara during the long night feedings just to keep her company. Their partnership deepened through the shared work of raising a child. Clara found herself relying on Elias in ways she never had on William, not because William had been inadequate, but because their circumstances had been different. With William, she'd been a young bride playing house, trying to figure out how to be a wife and mother with more enthusiasm than skill. With Elias, she was a survivor building something new from hard-won wisdom. And somewhere in those long summer days, as they worked side by side in the garden with Thomas sleeping in a basket nearby, as they shared meals and conversation and the daily rhythms of family life, Clara realized that what she felt for Elias had grown into something that deserved to be called love. Different from what she'd felt for William, yes, but no less real. It was late August when she finally said it out loud. They were sitting on the porch after dinner, Thomas asleep inside, the valley below them painted gold by the setting sun. Elias was carving another toy, a horse this time, and Clara was mending one of his shirts. "I love you," she said into the comfortable silence. Elias's knife stopped moving. He looked up slowly, his expression careful. "Clara, I know this wasn't what we agreed to. I know we said this was partnership, not romance, but I need you to know." She set down her mending and met his eyes. "I love you. Not the same way I loved William, but just as deeply. You've given me and Thomas a home, a family, a future. You've stood by us when no one else would. And somewhere along the way, you became essential to me." He set down his carving and moved to sit beside her on the porch swing, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I've loved you for months," he said quietly. "Maybe since that first night on the porch at the auction. But I didn't think you'd ever be ready to hear it, didn't want to pressure you or make you feel obligated." "I'm not obligated. I'm choosing this." Clara reached for his hand. "Choosing you. If you'll have me, really have me, as your wife in all ways." Elias's fingers tightened around hers. "I've wanted nothing more. But I need you to be sure. This isn't about gratitude or feeling like you owe me. This is about—" She kissed him, cutting off his words with the first real kiss they'd shared since their wedding day. It was tentative at first, both of them uncertain, but it deepened quickly into something genuine and warm and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, Elias was smiling, a real smile, open and unguarded in a way she rarely saw. "I'm going to take that as confirmation that you're sure." "Very sure." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steadiness that had become her anchor. "We've built something real here, something worth keeping. Then we'll keep it." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You, me, and Thomas. Our family." That night, for the first time since their marriage, Clara went to Elias's room instead of her own. They came together slowly, carefully. Two people who'd each lost love before and knew its fragility. There was grief woven through their intimacy, for Anne and William, for the lives that had been and could never be again. But there was also hope, the possibility of building something new without erasing what had come before. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Elias's arm around her and the sound of Thomas's breathing from the cradle they'd moved into the room, Clara felt something settle in her chest. This was her life now. Not the one she'd planned, not the one she'd lost, but the one she'd somehow, improbably, built from the ruins. The autumn arrived with its usual mountain drama, aspens turning gold, nights growing crisp, the first threat of snow on the highest peaks. Thomas was sitting up now, babbling nonsense syllables, reaching for everything with chubby hands. He had William's dark hair and Clara's green eyes, but his personality was entirely his own, determined, curious, quick to laugh, but equally quick to rage when frustrated. "He's going to be a handful," Elias observed one afternoon as Thomas shrieked with delight while knocking over a tower of wooden blocks for the 10th time. "He's going to be extraordinary," Clara corrected, scooping up her son and kissing his round cheek. "Just like his father's." The plural was deliberate, because Thomas had two fathers, the one who'd given him life and the one who was raising him. Clara had placed William's photograph in Thomas's room, and she told him stories about the man he'd never meet. But Elias was the one who walked him when he cried, who carved him toys, who would teach him to trap and hunt and build. Both men mattered. Both would shape who Thomas became. In October, Clara made her first trip back to the small homestead where she'd lived with William and Grace. She'd been avoiding it, unable to face the memories, but Elias had gently suggested it might be time. They drove down together, Thomas bundled against the cold, and Clara stood in the overgrown garden looking at the cabin that had once been her entire world. It looked smaller than she remembered, more worn. The porch steps Elias had built still stood solid, but the rest of the place showed the neglect of nearly a year's abandonment. Clara walked slowly to the two crosses in the corner of the property, to the graves she'd carved and tended and wept over. "Hello, William," she said softly, kneeling despite the cold ground. "Hello, my Grace. I brought someone to meet you." She unwrapped Thomas from his blankets enough that his face showed, his dark eyes bright and alert. "This is your son, William, Thomas William Crow. He's healthy and strong and so loved. I wish you could have met him." Her voice broke. "I wish a lot of things, but mostly I'm grateful that I had you both, even for too short a time, that I survived losing you, that I found Elias and built something new." Elias stood back, giving her privacy, but Clara called him forward. "Come meet them. They're part of our family too." He knelt beside her, and together they told the graves about their life, about the cabin on the mountain, about the town slowly accepting them, about Thomas's first smile and the way he laughed when Elias made funny faces. It felt right, including William and Grace in their story, rather than pretending they'd never existed. "I'll always love you," Clara said finally, standing and brushing dirt from her skirt. "Both of you, but I'm building a future now, and I hope, you'd be happy for me." The wind whispered through the pines, and Clara chose to hear it as blessing. They returned to the mountain as the first snow began to fall, Thomas warm between them on the wagon seat. The cabin came into view looking welcoming despite the weather, smoke rising from the chimney, lamplight glowing in the windows, the promise of warmth and safety waiting inside. "Home," Elias said simply. "Yes," Clara agreed. "Home." That winter was harsh, with snows that lasted for days and temperatures that dropped to punishing lows. But inside the cabin, the Crow family stayed warm. Elias taught Clara to read the signs that meant a storm was coming, and she taught him songs she'd learned as a child, singing them to Thomas as he drifted off to sleep. They celebrated Thomas's first Christmas with a small pine tree decorated with carved ornaments Elias had made and popcorn strings Clara had prepared. And when Clara discovered in January that she was pregnant again, this time with Elias's child, they received the news with joy tempered by experience. They knew the risks, knew that nothing was guaranteed, but they also knew they could face whatever came together. "Another one," Elias said, his hand on her still flat belly. "Thomas is going to have a brother or sister. Are you ready for that? 2 children? I'm ready for whatever comes with you." He kissed her softly. "We'll make it work. We always do." The second baby, a girl they named Anne Grace, honoring both of their lost loves, arrived in early autumn with less drama than Thomas had. She was small and delicate where Thomas had been robust, with Elias's dark eyes and a temperament that was noticeably calmer than her brother's. Pine Hollow received the news of her birth without the speculation that had accompanied Thomas's arrival. The Crows were an established family now, accepted as part of the community's fabric. When Clara brought Anne Grace to town for the first time, she was greeted with genuine warmth and congratulations that had no undercurrent of judgment. "You've built a beautiful family," Harriet Mills said, admiring the baby. "I'm so glad you found happiness again, Clara." "So am I," Clara said honestly. "It took a long time, and it looks different than I expected, but yes, I'm happy." And she was. Not every moment. There were still hard days when grief rose up unexpectedly, when she missed William and Grace with an ache that never fully disappeared. But those moments were balanced by others filled with laughter and love, and the messy reality of raising children with a partner who understood both her strength and her scars. The years passed with the steady rhythm of mountain life. Thomas grew into a sturdy boy with his father's determination and his mother's stubborn refusal to quit. Anne Grace became a quiet, thoughtful child who loved books and flowers and helping her mother in the garden. A third child arrived when Clara was 36, another boy they named Samuel, and the cabin rang with noise and chaos and life. Elias expanded their home, adding rooms as the family grew, building a legacy in wood and stone that would outlast them all. Clara became known in Pine Hollow not as the cursed widow, but as Mrs. Crow, the mountain woman with the strong children and the stubborn garden that somehow produced vegetables even at that elevation. She never forgot William and Grace. Their photographs remained in places of honor. Their stories were told to the children. But she stopped living in the past and learned to fully inhabit her present. And on quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and the mountains stood dark against the stars, Clara and Elias would sit on their porch and marvel at what they'd built. Not a fairy tale, not the lives they'd imagined in their youth, but something real and hard-won and precious, precisely because it had been forged from loss and choice in equal measure. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked one such evening, her hand in his. "Buying my basket that night, taking on me and all my complications?" Elias considered the question seriously, as he considered everything. "No, not once. You gave me a reason to be alive again instead of just surviving. That's worth more than I can say. Even though it was hard, even though the town judged us, especially because it was hard." He squeezed her hand. "Easy things don't mean much. But what we built, fighting for it, protecting it, refusing to let anyone else define it for us, that matters." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, looking out at the valley where Pine Hollow lay sleeping. The town that had shunned her had eventually embraced her, but it didn't matter as much as it once had. She'd learned that approval from others was nice, but not necessary. What mattered was the family she'd chosen and who'd chosen her back. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for seeing me when no one else would, for standing with me, for loving Thomas as your own." "Thank you for letting me," Elias replied, "for trusting me with your heart after it had been broken, for building this life with me." They sat in comfortable silence as night deepened around them. Two people who'd found each other in the darkest moments of their lives and had somehow, improbably, built something luminous from the darkness. The woman no one would bid on had become the heart of a family that didn't need the town's approval to know their worth. And the man who'd bought her basket, not out of pity but recognition, had discovered that the bravest thing he'd ever done wasn't surviving alone in the mountains. It was choosing to live again. Inside the cabin, their children slept peacefully. Thomas with his wooden animals arranged precisely on the shelf beside his bed. Anne Grace with a pressed flower marking her place in the book she was reading. Samuel in his cradle, one fist curled beside his cheek. 3 children, 3 chances to get it right, 3 lives that proved love could survive loss and grow stronger for it. This was their story. Not the one that began with tragedy, though tragedy was woven through it. Not the one that began with romance, though love had found them eventually. But the one that began with a choice, to stand together rather than fall apart separately, to build something new from what remained, to honor the past while refusing to be imprisoned by it. And in the end, that choice had made all the difference.